I wanted to talk to you about evolutionary biology.
All right.
And to being someone who teaches that and being, as that's your discipline, and seeing all of these, I mean, what is it like being a professor and being someone who's studying this stuff and then seeing all these weird traits and all these weird personality aspects demonstrate themselves in these times of crisis? Like seeing these situations.
You're talking about people.
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting question. I have become fascinated. I didn't start out studying people, but the longer I proceed in evolutionary biology, the more interested I am in people. And let's put it this way. Sometimes something is surprising, but in general, if you have the right tools to understand people at an evolutionary level, things make a certain amount of sense. I have something I say to students frequently, which is if a situation is confusing with people, very often it makes more sense if you turn the sound all the way down so you can't hear what they're actually saying. Because very often what's being enacted between people isn't really about the content of what they're saying. It's about something else. And so let's take, for example, my first project. When I was an undergraduate, I was studying with a very famous evolutionary biologist named Bob Trivers. And I wrote a paper for his class, and it was about the Holocaust. It was about I was testing the question. At the time, it was relatively commonplace to hear that Hitler was insane. And something about that didn't ring true to me. And I wanted to know, evolutionarily speaking, was he insane? And in studying that question, it became very clear that insane was the wrong description, that he was a monster, but he was a rational monster from the point of view of advancing German genes. And that was a very troubling discovery to me, that in effect, what he was doing was, it's the worst thing imaginable, but from the point of view of genes that are attempting to spread across the globe and exclude alternative genes from access to resources, it was perfectly reasonable. Not only what he did to Jews and homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses, but the military plan. The future of Germany lies in Russia. The idea was that this was actually a sophisticated plan that would have advanced the cause of spreading German genes spectacularly, had, frankly, so many million Russians not been ready to give their lives to turn the German war machine around. So what I'm saying, this has to be dealt with carefully, because people hear you say that and they think that you're justifying it. But, I'm, of course, a Jew, whose ancestors were from Europe. There's no part of me that is in any way okay with what happened. Quite the opposite. But understanding that even though the Darwinism that Hitler was deploying was deformed and not accurate and defensible in a logical sense, the plan he was advancing was German genes attempting to take over a larger fraction of the resources that planet Earth has to offer than they had available to them at that point in the 30s. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there's something that we often teach students first when we get to them, which is called the naturalistic fallacy. It means that just because something is true doesn't mean it's good, that it ought to be true. And so discovering the nature of something like the Holocaust is very important in the sense that it allows you to grapple with it logically, but as you're grappling with it logically, people want to imagine that you're saying it was okay, and that's the opposite. There are many things that are true for evolutionary reasons that are completely unacceptable, and understanding what those things are gives you a pretty good shot at preventing them from unfolding.
It also really is a problem when something becomes taboo to even consider or to look at. Like you can't look at the idea that he wasn't insane and that he was in fact rational in rationalizing his horrific acts, and that there was some sort of a plan to it all. And you would say that even by enacting that plan, you would be insane in terms of how you think of the world and I think of the world. Like if we found out that Jamie over here was thinking about starting a master race and killing everybody off, we would go, oh, Jamie's kind of insane. I mean, that's like and to say, no, he's not insane, he has a rational plan.
Yeah.
Like immediately people would want to justify any horrific thing they could say about you.
Yeah. Just to be clear, though, Jamie's not doing that, right? Okay,
Jamie's a good guy.
Right, fair enough.
He's like sports. That's all. That's the kind of takeover he's into.
Yeah.
But having taboo subjects, or having things you cannot consider, even if you're clearly not a racist person, even if you're clearly not a person who advocates genocide, the idea that intellectual discussions cannot be pursued about specific topics.
Well, the first thing, if you're going to go into evolutionary biology, especially if you're going to get anywhere near human beings, you have to really put aside the idea of taboo in intellectual space. You have to be able to consider everything, because so much of the story is, it goes from bizarre to horrifying, and there's also great beauty. I mean, one of the important things to remember is that the adaptive evolutionary process gave us not only our worst characteristics, our tendency to war and to genocide and to oppression, but it gave us our best characteristics too, our capacity to love, to empathize, to be compassionate, to sacrifice for others. So all of those things are evolutionary products. And, the message I try to convey to people when I talk about this is that we have to pick and choose which of the evolutionary products we want to honor and preserve, and which of them we wish to bar from the landscape. And this is really what civilization is about. Civilization is about taking the whole spectrum of things that we're capable of and providing a landscape for the ones that are honorable and good, and making the ones that aren't honorable and good so expensive that nobody would consider engaging in.
The reason that you know what's relevant is because some things don't change over time, and you've been evolving through 3.5 billion years. So you've built yourself, if we go back to that other diagram, you imagine the levels there, from the microactivities to the abstractions. You think about how much building had to go in before you could undertake those microactions. So like here, you could move your hand. Well, that's great. How do you get the hand? Well, it took a long time. It took almost all of the 3.5 billion years before you managed to come up with a hand. So even underneath the microactions, there's this massive evolutionary history that's been built up partly as a consequence of some of the unchanging features of the environment, or at least in consequence of some of the slower changing features of the environment, that has given you this incredibly complex body that's really good at doing some things and not very good at doing other things at all. And so that's how you solve the relevance problem. And I actually think it's one of the most powerful arguments for the necessity of evolutionary theory. It's like, this problem is so complex because it's not only do you have to adapt to the environment across time, so you have to build a body that adapts to the environment. It's worse than that. It's like the train passing through the box. The environment's not stable. It keeps shifting and turning and moving and twisting. And so not only do you have to adapt to the environment, you have to adapt flexibly to the environment while it transforms itself at different levels of what would you say? At different levels of totality. Because sometimes there's minor changes in the environment. Sometimes, a meteor hits the Earth and, we're plunged into darkness for 4 years, or there's an ice age or something like that. So the levels of transformation in the environment can be radical. And the evolutionary process has to keep up with that. And the way it works, apparently, I don't believe this is the whole story, although it's more or less the whole Darwinian story, is that something more or less works and then makes 1 million copies of itself. And there's tiny variations in those copies, often, at least in principle, because of copying error, which is where I think the theory's weak. And then they all die except 2. And so why didn't those die? And the answer is, well, they happened by chance to vary in the direction that the environment varied, and so they get to continue. And so the reason evolution works is because everything dies. Everything fails. So, because you think, well, keeping up with a randomly changing environment is impossible. Well, so how do you do it? Well, you do 1 million things. Most of them don't work, but you only have to succeed enough to propagate yourself once.
natural selection chooses among self-replicating entities. Those self-replicating entities have some kind of power over their probability of being copied, of being replicated, of being passed on. In practice, that almost always means choosing between alternative DNA genes. So it's about the natural selection, the disproportionate, it's about the unequal survival of genes through generations. That is natural selection. We see it in the form of changes in phenotypes, that's to say, changes in bodies, because it's through the changes in the bodies that the genes induce that they ensure their survival or fail to survive. The ones that are good at surviving are the ones that are good at building bodies, that are good at surviving and reproducing. We're gene machines in the sense that a body is constructed by genes that have been successful in surviving in the past. They're good at surviving because they're good at constructing machines in which they survive. So a body is a machine for the propagation of the genes that built it. One important active area is the origin of sex and why we have sex at all. It's controversial and interesting and unsolved. Another one, I think, would be the evolution of consciousness, especially human consciousness. Another one would be the embryological routes by which genes influence bodies. Well, the mystery there is that on the view of the selfish gene, every animal is trying to maximize the number of genes that it passes on. And so mixing half your genes with those of a sexual partner seems like an odd thing to do. And on the face of it, it's throwing away half your genes with every child you have. So it needs an explanation, and various explanations have been suggested.